Until the lions have their own historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. The rhythm of Cuban life is one of intended racial unity, a chorus of "we are all Cubans," echoing through their hearts and minds. However, beneath this surface of unity, a small but growing group of educators and scholar activists are determined to bring Afro-Cuban history to the forefront of education. Esteban Morales Dominguez, in his landmark 2012 book, Race in Cuba, Essays on the Revolution and Racial Inequality, argues that without racial awareness, Afro-Cuban students cannot effectively confront stereotypes, discrimination, and racism. Dominguez and other scholars have been striving to integrate Afro-Cuban history into the Cuban education system through textbooks, classroom lessons, and the curriculum. This history, they believe, is a vital tool to awaken children and youth to their cultural heritage and identity. It is worth noting that despite the official stance on racial unity, blacks continue to be the most discriminated group of all in Cuba. Unlike misguided people in the dominant society, we believe that the idea that studying this history threatens Cuban nationalism is false. Indeed, embracing Afro-Cuban history means recognizing Cuba as a multiracial and multicolored society. While Cuba's census identifies most citizens as white, the reality of its people reflects a spectrum of colors with deep African roots. The mestizo, or mulatto, reflect this mixed racial identity of Cuba. To further complicate this matter, people in this mixed race category, by Cuban standards, are considered white. The latest census reported that 64.3% of Cubans identified as white, yet the visibility of Afro-Cuban culture suggests a more significant presence. However, the 2012 Cuban census reported that blacks made up only 9.3%, and mestizos were 26.6% of the population. Many Afro-Cuban intellectuals call for a new count of people of African descent, convinced that the official figures underrepresent their true numbers. The history of Africans in Cuba dates back to the 1500s, when Spanish colonizers brought about 8,000 Africans to work on sugar plantations. By 1838, there were nearly 400,000 slaves on the island. Slavery ended in 1886, but black Cubans remained marginalized and excluded from education. Slavery in Cuba began shortly after Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492. The Spanish colonizers initially tried to enslave the indigenous Taino population, but due to high mortality rates from disease, overwork, and brutal treatment, they soon turned to importing African slaves. The sugar industry became the driving force behind the expansion of slavery in Cuba. By the 18th century, sugar plantations were flourishing, and the demand for labor increased exponentially, leading to a massive influx of African slaves. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, nearly 1 million Africans were forcibly brought to Cuba. The conditions of slavery in Cuba were harsh and inhumane. Most slaves worked on sugar plantations, enduring grueling labor from dawn until dusk. The work was physically demanding, involving planting, harvesting, and processing sugarcane. In cities, slaves worked as domestic servants, artisans, and in construction. Although urban slaves had slightly better living conditions, they were still subjected to harsh treatment and lacked freedom. Slaves lived in barracones, barracks, or bohíos, huts, which were overcrowded, poorly constructed, and lacked basic sanitation. Their diet was meager, often consisting of rice, beans, and occasional meat or fish. Physical punishment was common, with whippings, beatings, and mutilations used to enforce discipline and suppress resistance. Despite the harsh conditions, slaves resisted through various means, including work slowdowns, sabotage, escape, and organized rebellions. Despite the oppressive conditions, African slaves retained elements of their cultures, which influenced Cuban society. This included music, dance, religion, such as Santeria, a syncretic religion combining Yoruba beliefs with Catholicism, and cuisine. Slaves tried to maintain family structures and kinship bonds despite the frequent separation through sales. They often formed tight-knit communities, providing mutual support and solidarity. Cuban laws, influenced by Spanish colonial policies, codified the treatment and rights, or lack thereof, of slaves. These laws were designed to protect slaveholders' interests and maintain control over the enslaved population. Pressure from abolitionist movements, economic shifts, and slave resistance led to gradual changes. In 1880, the Spanish government passed the Law of Free Womb, granting freedom to children born to slaves. Full emancipation was achieved in 1886. Slavery was integral to Cuba's economy, particularly in the production of sugar, which became the island's most important export. The wealth generated by the sugar industry was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, making Cuba one of the world's leading sugar producers. After emancipation, former slaves faced significant challenges, including discrimination, limited economic opportunities, and continued exploitation. Many continued to work in the sugar industry under exploitative conditions similar to slavery. The legacy of slavery has had a lasting impact on Cuban society. Racial inequality and discrimination persisted long after emancipation, affecting Afro-Cubans' social, economic, and political status. The contributions of African slaves and their descendants have profoundly shaped Cuban culture, from music and dance, such as the rumba and son, to religion and cuisine. Efforts to recognize and reconcile with this dark chapter in history continue. Education, cultural initiatives, and scholarly work aim to preserve the memory of slavery and honor the resilience of those who endured it. The 1959 Cuban Revolution aimed to erase institutional racism and the color line, promising free education for all. However, poverty prevented many blacks from taking full advantage of these opportunities. Those who did manage to enter the educational system and thrive eventually became professionals by the 1980s. But the economic hardships of the 1990s, following the collapse of Soviet support, disproportionately affected Black Cubans, pushing them back to the margins. The economic disparity between Afro-Cubans and whites is quite stark. 73% of scientists and technicians are white. 80% of professors at the University of Havana are white as well. These numbers hold relatively true for the rest of the country. Blacks are unemployed at double the rate of whites and comprise 85% of the prison population. Well, we are not surprised for obvious reasons. We only seek to expose truth. Let's continue. The role of art and education. Simply, there are two tracks for blacks in Cuba: those who strive to get into university and those who do not. This is quite obvious in other parts of the world, since a higher education for all intents and purposes guarantees a higher salary. However, to succeed in school, black students must work twice as hard, a sentiment shared by many blacks in the United States too. The effort to incorporate Afro-Cuban history into Cuba's educational system is not just about acknowledging the past, it's about empowering future generations. Educators and scholars believe that a comprehensive understanding of Afro-Cuban history will enable students to navigate and challenge the stereotypes and systemic discrimination they face. Integrating this history into the curriculum can foster a sense of pride and identity among Afro-Cuban students. It can also educate all Cuban students about the diverse cultural fabric of their nation, promoting a deeper understanding and appreciation of their shared heritage. As the students in central Havana continue their morning march to school, they carry with them the potential to become the bearers of a more inclusive and truthful narrative of their nation's history. The chorus of "We are all Cubans" can ring truer and stronger when it includes the rich and complex history of Afro-Cuban identity. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section.